This episode of the Quantum Space Innovating Trust podcast is brought to you in association with Vibu Systems, pioneers in software protection, licensing, and long-term digital trust. Quantum computing is no longer theoretical, and it poses a fundamental challenge to today's cryptography. Methods like RSA and ECC will not survive the quantum era. With its next code meter generation, Vibu Systems is already preparing a smooth, compatible transition to post-quantum ready security across hardware, software, and cloud licensing. Discover how CodeMeter is being engineered for the post-quantum future and why preparing early is the only safe strategy. Visit vibu.com/PQC today.
Over the past weeks on the quantum space, we've been working through a shift that has been sitting in plain sight for years. Licensing is no longer a commercial wrapper around software. It operates as an enforcement mechanism, the point at which control, entitlement, and runtime behavior are actually determined. That argument moves licensing out of the margins of business models and places it directly in the operational structure of trust alongside identity, cryptography, and security. But once you accept that framing, the next question becomes unavoidable. If licensing is enforcement, then how is it actually implemented? Where does it hold under real-world conditions, or where does it break? Because the reality is this. Modern software businesses are no longer defined by just what they build, but how they control access, manage entitlement, and maintain integrity over time across devices, environments, and increasingly very long life cycles. Subscription and usage-based models are often presented as commercial innovation. In practice, they depend on licensing infrastructure that has to function as part of a system of control, a system of record, and increasingly, a system of compliance. That pressure is only increasing. Regulatory frameworks such as the Cyber Resilience Act and NIS2 are raising expectations around software integrity, traceability, and lifecycle accountability. Licensing now sits directly inside that conversation. So today we've moved from theory to implementation. This episode looks at how licensing actually works in practice as infrastructure, as enforcement, and as a commercial system that has to operate at scale. Joining me is Stefan Bamberg of Vibu Systems, who spent more than a decade working at the intersection of software protection, licensing, and entitlement management in industrial and embedded environments. After studying computer science at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, Stefan first worked on developing traffic simulation systems. He then switched to information and telecommunications technology, where he initially worked in project and product management. He later took charge of managing the sales department, where he says he found his true passion. Since 2012, he's been with Vibu Systems, currently in the position of Director Sales and Key Account Management. Stefan, welcome to the Quantum Space.
Hello, Steve. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Let's jump right in and talk about the business model shift and trust control. Subscription and usage-based licensing models are often presented as a revenue evolution. But from a trust and control perspective, what actually changes when software moves from perpetual licensing to subscription? Who gains control and who gives it up?
For many years now, there has been a trend in the software industry to shift from one-time licenses to subscription licenses. The advantage here is clear. The vendor moves the business from a one-time payment to a recurring revenue stream. Users also benefit, as this results in lower annual costs that can be charged to operational expenses and do not require a large one-time investment booked on capital expenditure. In the long term, however, the vendor can also generate higher and more predictable revenue, which makes the model so attractive to them. The switch does indeed raise the question of what changes the shift in the licensing model brings for both sides. Fundamentally, the model shifts from outright ownership of the software to a right of use granted by the vendor. The user often benefits from the software updates made available as part of this arrangement. At this point, the vendor gains control over license renewals or revocations, as well as the provision of new features within the software. However, this also applies to pricing, as the exclusive right of use within the framework of a subscription means that the user is dependent on the vendor, which may make a quick switch to another vendor difficult or even impossible. At the same time, this also leads to a technical dependence on the vendor if there are no standard interfaces through which one's own data can be transferred to another product, just in case. If we consider legal requirements, for example, you mentioned that under the European Cyber Resilience Act, then from a vendor's perspective, licensing also leads to important transparency regarding the licenses issued in the field, specifically which customer is actually using which version of the software. This offers a further advantage for the vendor, who can also implement secure patch management on this basis.
Are we seeing a broader shift from product trust to provider trust, where customers are no longer just buying software, but perhaps entering a long-term dependency relationship with a licensing and entitlement infrastructure?
Yes, definitely. Customers increasingly enter long-term dependency relationships with vendors, not just buying a product, but committing to a vendor's entitlement, identity, data, and licensing ecosystems. Trust is moving away from the product itself and toward the vendor stewardship, governance, and long-term alignment. Customers no longer buy a product, but access governed by an infrastructure. And this leads to all challenges we face with cloud-based infrastructure. You must trust in the system availability of the vendor. You have to trust in the cybersecurity measures a vendor established. And last but not least, have to trust in the technological and financial stability of the vendor and the provider of the infrastructure.
In a regulated or a long life cycle environment, such as industrial control, embedded systems, or critical infrastructure, how do you design subscription and licensing models that can stay commercially flexible without undermining operational stability over, say, 10 to 15 years?
This is a very good question. Embedded systems and critical infrastructure environments impose constraints that are fundamentally different from IT or software as a service. Systems must run reliable for a decade or more, sometimes even untouched. One major point is the fact that most of these devices run in isolated environments, so that the renewal of a subscription is challenging, but possible, for example, with gateways rolling out license updates automatically within the plant. During a production process, an expired license may not cause any interruptions, and here the magic word is grace period. In case of a license loss or expiration of subscription, the application runs also without a license for a certain predefined time period defined by the vendor. Maybe just with limited functions, but finalizing at least the current process step. If we talk about operational stability over 10 to 15 years, which is standard in these industries, the compatibility of interfaces is an absolute must, not only because compatibility between applications, but also for compliance reasons and the need for avoiding recertifications. The commercial model can change over time, but the technical enforcement of the subscription model must stay same over the whole period of usage.
Let's talk a little bit about architecture and operational reality now. Licensing infrastructure is often framed as a classic make or buy decision. Now, from your experience, where do companies most often underestimate the complexity of building their own licensing and entitlement systems?
The challenges you face are diverse. You need to bring products to market quickly, scale globally, and support a variety of business models, from perpetual license and subscriptions to trial versions and feature-based offerings, preferable also for after-sales. At the same time, licensing must function reliably on the customer side in offline systems, network environments, and cloud-based deployments. Most often underestimated is the fact that a licensing entitlement system is a cross-sectional topic, touching nearly all parts of a company, going deep into the details concerning, for example, multi-channel sales, back-office integration, of course security, compliance requirements, and don't forget the availability needs. It is one of the most important systems in a whole infrastructure of a company, which allows a vendor to earn money with flexible license models and to control their usage. On the other hand, there is a strong need to protect the application which checks the licenses, to prevent hackers, to break the system, and to avoid losing the valuable intellectual property of the vendor. It's not just developing a small license key generator, but there is the need for a whole entitlement management system, also considering edge case like hardware failures with the need of license reactivation, or handling virtual environments or standard cases like subscription renewals, license migration, or withdrawals. The resources, not only the direct financial interest, but also the human resources needed for the development and especially for the ongoing maintenance, are underestimated in most cases. Based on our experiences with customers, we see that a homegrown solution is not a cost saver. It needs a high investment in the beginning and continuous operational costs for the maintenance and support team, which can easily exceed 500,000 euros in a larger scenario. We published a white paper titled The Commercial Case for CodeMeter, providing a deeper analysis of this topic.
So in your experience, what tends to break first in homegrown licensing systems as companies scale? Is it enforcement or entitlement management or customer experience or even internal operations?
In the very beginning, everything seems to work quite well with a homegrown solution. But in the moment the company scales and so does success, the number of licenses increase rapidly, which has, of course, an immediate effect on a bad scalability both in sales and support department. A missing integration in the ERP back office system of a company, which would offer a 100% automation of license creation and management, leads to unnecessary resource consumption and costs in the company and acts as a bottleneck for the company revenue. The customer experience drops down because of missing self-service options and complicate license handling processes like license reactivation, transfer of licenses, and renewal of licenses. Homegrown solutions are characterized by the fact that they can be launched initially with relatively little effort and budget. But the total bill comes later, if the requirements and needs are increasing with success. So typically, there are no reliable traceability options available, no OEM support in case of supporting global sales channels, and the internal IT has the maintenance task for another system with an interface, both to their own internal back-office structure and to the open internet to allow an activation of licenses 24/7 around the globe. And again, the most important point is the protection of the license keys and their license checks in the application itself. This is a task for real security experts. Even the best designed homegrown solution is worthless and a waste of time if it can be easily hacked. Licensing and protection must go hand in hand here.
How important is it that licensing infrastructure works consistently across hardware, software, and even cloud environments? And what goes wrong when those layers are handled separately?
It's critical that license infrastructure works consistently across hardware, software, and cloud environments, because separating those layers creates different license logic, different cryptography stacks, independent update cycles, and uneven compliance gaps. The result is predictable. A larger attack surface, higher maintenance, and operational costs and resource consumption, and a broken customer experience of different ways to handle licenses for different platforms and applications. A unified entitlement structure avoids that by using a single policy model, multiple license container options, one entitlement backend, and a consistent audit trail end-to-end. That's not only a question of commercial optimization, that's risk reduction.
Let's talk about ROI, return on investment, and some automation and commercial impact of all of this. Now, your published return on investment analysis suggests that professional licensing and protection systems can reach break-even in roughly a year and generate significant multi-year returns. In real deployment, what are the biggest variables that determine whether return on investment is fast or ultimately disappointing?
We evaluated the return on invest based on our experiences with our real customer base, which contains small and medium enterprises as well as large companies with all their specific requirements and needs. In real deployments, the return on invest varies widely, and the biggest drivers are organizational, not technical. A fast return on invest tends to happen when the piracy baseline is measurable, when feature segmentation enables real upsell potential, when teams are drowning in manual licensing work, and when sales actively use flexible pricing models. Under those conditions, break even in roughly 12 months and a multi-year return on invest in the 350% to 750% range, as shown in our ROE-focused white paper, is absolutely realistic. Disappointing return on invest usually appears when licensing is implemented purely as a defensive control, without changes in sales behavior. If feature packaging stays monolithic, pricing doesn't evolve, or the sales organization doesn't adapt, the technical platform alone can't deliver the expected return. Technology enables return on invest, but the organization determines it.
The return on investment model highlights not just revenue protection, but also operational savings. So we have fewer manual licensing processes, reduced support load, and less custom development. Would you say that companies are still underestimating the internal cost of manual or fragmented licensing operations?
Absolutely. Companies still massively underestimate the internal costs of manual or fragmented licensing operations. The hidden costs add up quickly, for example, full-time staff handling order processing, teams generating keys manually, one-off contract exceptions, migration cleanup work, and, most of all, developer time spent maintaining outdated or customer-specific license logic. Our return on invest model quantifies this saving across development, order processing, and support clearly. The real insight is that licensing automation isn't just revenue protection. It's an internal efficiency multiplier that frees people, reduces complexity, and removes entire classes' operational overhead. The goal is an order comes in, is processed automatically, and the licenses are delivered automatically to the customer.
Do you see licensing automation becoming part of a much broader trust operational layer inside organizations alongside security controls, compliance tooling, and audit capabilities?
Yes. Licensing automation is absolutely becoming part of a broader trust operations layer. And that represents a major shift in how organizations think about licensing. Modern licensing now intersects with the software bill of material tracking, secure update enforcement, device identity management. That means to know which device is where and which devices are allowed to communicate with other devices. Audit and compliance reporting, secure boot and runtime integrity, and even usage analytics. In other words, licensing evolves into a unified layer that combines commercial enforcement, security enforcement, and compliance instrumentation. In regulation environments, critical infrastructures like energy, water, banks, and so on. This takes on an even bigger role. Licensing effectively becomes evidence infrastructure, a verifiable system of record that demonstrates entitlement, integrity, and compliance across devices and deployments.
Let's spend this last section talking about risks, limits, and what is actually market reality. Now, subscription and feature-based licensing promise flexibility, but where do they introduce new risk or customer friction if badly designed?
Subscription and feature-based licensing can deliver real flexibility, but from our experiences, if poorly designed, they often introduce new risks and friction. Over-aggressive enforcement mechanism, for example, can trigger production downtime, while weak user experience creates frustration during activation or usage of license. Unclear renewal logic leads to operational confusion internally and even worse on the customer side. And cloud-only dependencies of license models can even create plant-level outage risks, even if they offer more license usage transparency for the vendor. Over-fragmented SKUs overwhelm customers and sales teams alike. Ultimately, flexibility without a coherent architecture becomes chaos, increasing risk instead of reducing it.
In your experience, would you say that there is a point where licensing and monetization models become too granular or complex for customers to understand? And does that complexity itself become a trust problem?
Yes, there is a very high risk. When licensing and monetization models become too granular, they can cross a line where customers no longer understand what they are really paying for. Pricing becomes confusing, feature bundles feel arbitrary, and customers start feeling nickel and dimed for every capability. As transparency fades, that complexity itself erodes trust because customers suspect the model is designed to extract value rather than deliver it. In contrast, good licensing design strengthens trust. It offers clear functional value, provides transparent entitlement visibility, enforces rules predictably, and avoids unexpected deactivation. Simplicity and clarity signal that the model is built to support customers, not exploit them. You have to be aware that trust is lost more quickly than you can build it up.
Final question, Stefan. Looking ahead 3 to 5 years, do you expect licensing systems to be evaluated more as a security and compliance infrastructure rather than, say, purely commercial tooling?
In any case, it will be both. The question is not only what is your pricing model, but how does your licensing architecture guarantee software integrity and regulatory compliance in the next decades? Already today, we have a lot of compliance drivers, like the already mentioned European Cyber Resilience Act, the NIS2, the IEC 62443, the Digital Product Passport concepts, and of course the European AI Act, which cares about the challenging when using artificial intelligence also in the B2B sector. Licensing system will be evaluated on topics like cryptographic agility, secure update enforceability, audit traceability, runtime integrity, and of course, a long-term key management. I'm pretty sure that this is the beginning of a new era of cybersecurity and product security. And not only driven by European countries. Other countries like the US and China are about to follow because the need for security doesn't stop at country borders. So licensing is no longer just a tool, but an important enabler for placing secure products in the global markets and to protect the own intellectual property and, of course, business.
I think what this conversation makes clear is that licensing has moved well beyond its original role as a commercial control, because it now operates as part of the infrastructure that governs how software behaves in the real world, how it's accessed, how it is updated, how it is secured, and how it remains compliant over time. And that shift changes how licensing needs to be designed. It has to scale across environments. It has to remain stable over very long life cycles. And more importantly, it has to balance commercial flexibility with operational predictability without introducing new risks into the system it's supposed to control. What also comes through clearly is that the technology alone is not the constraint. The real variable is organizational. Licensing only delivers value when commercial models, operational processes, and technical enforcements are aligned. Without that alignment, complexity increases, costs rise, and trust begins to erode rather than strengthen. If you want to go deeper into the commercial and operational side of this, including the ROI models and real-world deployment data discussed in this episode, you'll find a link on the Quantum Space website to the Vibu Systems white paper that we've referenced here today.
My thanks to today's guest, Stefan Bamberg, for grounding this discussion in how these systems actually work at scale.
Thank you very much, Steve. It was a real pleasure to talk about these topics with you.
You've been listening to Innovating Trust from the Quantum Space, where we examine the technologies, frameworks, and infrastructure that quietly make digital trust possible. Until next time, my name's Steve Atkins, and this is Innovating Trust. This was Innovating Trust, a Quantum Space podcast edited and produced by Crown Communications.